Right. Well, I start from looking at the what the Taliban leaders were able to talk to told us in terms of what the policy is concerning humanitarian access. The first thing they told us is that they have a code of conduct where the rules are spelled out, which is widely distributed, actually even available on their website. So look at that, and then you will know what we want and what are the rules to be respected, not only with regard to humanitarian access, but everything else. And the so-called Laiha essentially says, there are a certain number of rules that are set up by a specific commission dedicated to the task. NGOs or other humanitarian organizations or development organizations should deal with this commission, negotiate over access. Once there is an agreement, there would be binding for the Taliban and for the organization. In principle, what the commission decides is binding for Taliban groups and organizations at the local level. If any of these Taliban at the local level, small commanders, has an issue with that, it will have to communicate with the leadership in Pakistan for exemptions or for changes. It's not authorized to arbitrarily break the rules. Now, these are what they say, and that was repeated in detail by Kari Abbas, who is the chief of this commission, whom we contacted. It's not something surprising. There is some difference of views among the people we talked to about the specifics. But in general, what we can say is, I mentioned registration. Of course, there are a lot of allegations among the Taliban that some NGOs or other organizations spy on the Taliban, or individuals within those organizations spy on the Taliban. I'm not going to mention, they mention specific organizations, so I think it's not politically correct to repeat those allegations here. But certainly the Taliban believe, that there is some collaboration with the enemy, so with the Afghan government and with ISAF among military organizations. And one of the rules, is that, of course, you have to commit yourself not to collaborate with the enemy. If you get caught, then you will be in very, very serious trouble. Tax is payable to the Taliban, like everybody else is supposed to pay tax, but with regard to humanitarian work, there are exemptions. In particular, proper humanitarian work as opposed to development is not taxable. Some development work also is not taxable. For example, building schools or clinics is not taxable. Building roads is taxable. So there are rules, and this seems to be clear among the Taliban. And there is some divergence over monitoring. Some Taliban will say, we do inspect NGO or the offices of humanitarian organizations. Some others will say, no, we don't. It might be that varies from place to place, how strong the presence of the Taliban on the ground is. It might be that sometimes they don't want to talk about that. Certainly NGOs don't want to talk about that. We hear off the record that sometimes happens, although not necessarily all the time. It may be that sometimes the Taliban actually have informers within humanitarian organizations. So probably there is some variation, but generally speaking, the Taliban do say, we keep an eye on what humanitarian organizations do on the ground. They seem not to care very much about where the money comes from. At least these are the rules. Some Taliban on the ground will say, we do care, but in fact we know for a fact that there are NGOs and other organizations who receive money from Western governments, including Americans and British governments. And they don't seem to have a problem with the Taliban with that. So it seems to be true that funding, the source of funding for the projects which are being implemented is not a big issue. Now, so as I said, these rules imply that every organization has to contact the Taliban directly. So respecting the rules without having a formal agreement with the Taliban is not enough. Organizations are required to get in touch with the Taliban and get the register somehow. There is some discrepancy between the list of organizations to register that the Taliban give us and what people on the ground, whether NGO workers, humanitarian work, and Taliban told us. So that's a mystery we haven't been able to resolve yet. So there are some organizations that don't feature on the list, but do say or are said by the Taliban to have some kind of arrangement with them. So there is a discrepancy there. And of course, the Taliban are very clear about certain issues that are problematic for NGOs. So whereas on a number of issues, NGOs don't seem to have too much of a problem, what the Taliban demands are. I mean, NGOs accept they are operating in a war environment, so they know that to be careful, they know that there are often rules to be obeyed. But sometimes some of these rules are controversial, and particularly women's rights, or the different interpretation of women's rights. The Taliban will say, we do believe in women's rights, they are in the Quran, and that's what we stick to. And of course, that's not match exactly what humanitarian organization will consider to be human rights. Generally speaking, what the Taliban say is that as long as women only work with other women, their employment by humanitarian organization is allowed. It's not a problem, but there has to be no contact whatsoever with men. So whether in the office or in interact with the population, women will only have to deal with other women. And this is something that actually most humanitarian organizations, particularly NGOs, and particularly Afghan NGOs, seem not to have a problem with. But you might understand that some other international organizations like UN, etc., might find it a bit more difficult to stick to this kind of constraints. Although in practice, in offices in the districts, you won't see many, certainly foreign women working there, particularly in areas where the Taliban are strong. But in principle, that's something that does create some practical problems in terms of negotiating agreements with the Taliban. Now, so that's the view from the top. The view from the bottom, when we look at the Taliban, is that particularly the cadres of the Taliban, we're not talking about small commanders, but military commissioners at the provincial or district level, governors, these kind of people, they are aware what the policy is, and so their views and their answers match what Kingapos, the people at the top say. They know, of course, what the Leha says about this. Sometimes actually they express some criticism about certain rules, but they're aware what the rules are, so at least they know. Then there seems to be, if not some discussion now how to implement the rules, certainly it seems to be quite common that these kind of cards then manage to get exemptions or changes to the rules when they apply them in their province or in their district. I think the exemptions are granted at the provincial level. So, for example, in Kandahar, which was, of the two provinces, the most problematic one in terms of humanitarian access, it's pretty clear that many of the rules that were outlined to us did not apply anymore. So that humanitarian access was much more restricted than it should have been the case. And the Taliban will say there are reasons for that, of course. And the main reason, I will discuss that later, is the military situation on the ground. And of course, there might be violations of the rules which apply at the local level, so that does not lead to the deregistration of an organization, but it might lead to a suspension of registration in a particular province, whereas in other areas of the country they might still be able to operate. So these are some quotes. Again, they stress very much the fact that monitoring is in place, so don't play tricks on us. And of course, you can imagine a situation of war, and the Taliban have a reputation for, quick justice and even arbitrary justice. There is certainly a risk, an element of risk there, and we know there have been incidents where NGOs and other humanitarian organizations have been probably unfairly accused of spying on the Taliban. This happens quite often when some Taliban get killed or arrested. For example, the night raid, then the hunt for the informers gets started, and if the Taliban people don't know, of course, who's been informing. Anybody informing by the Taliban will be very careful not to get caught. So they're looking around for a scapegoat. That could be, the guy who goes to the district center for whatever reason. So some elder some people work in NGOs, for example, people who tend to move around, visit the district center, the provincial center. So of course NGOs, humanitarian organizations often are among the suspects. And I think, I think the Taliban commanders often know that they don't know, but they need to show to their rank and file that they're not completely in the dark about who is spying on them. So they look for a scapegoat. And we know that despite the fact there are rules about punishing people, trying people, often the commanders break these rules. Increasingly so, our sense is, without basically telling the leadership. They don't go through the Taliban justice system. They just take people out to some remote place and execute them if they believe that they are responsible for spying on them. So basically, there is here, in this case, some indiscipline within the Taliban, although it's difficult to document it because then what somebody's been executed in a remote area, we're not sure by whom, but then of course who's going to execute people like that, probably the Taliban. So we know there is something there, but it's difficult to pin down, who has done what and for what reason. You hear a lot of rumors, but then, documenting that is a bit more complicated. Some more quotes about this discrepancy between the rules established at the top and how they're implemented on the ground. And I said that the Kurds are well informed about policy. I would say not so the local commanders. The small commanders who lead 10, 15, 20 men, often they seem to have confused ideas about what the rules are. I remind you that the average Taliban commander might be in theory educated, but probably is not functionally literate, or certainly not a very great reader. So we know for a fact from other research we've done that often the code of conduct is not well known to the average Taliban commander. So the Kurds will know, the small commanders will not, and that's probably where their confusion comes from. Okay. Let's say, the underlying fact here is that, generally speaking, almost all the Taliban commanders we talk to are deeply suspicious about NGOs, or humanitarian organizations, whether particularly international ones. Afghan NGOs probably get, or some of them get, some more favorable views from the Taliban. But generally speaking, we detect a lot of hostility, a lot of prejudice. So I would say the leadership seems to be much more enlightened in a sense about NGOs, humanitarian organization, and the lower you go down the ranks, the more you have a strong sense of hostility. While the leadership, or the Kurds might be able to talk about things like development and have some of their own ideas about what development should be, at least they can discuss the topic. At the bottom of the Taliban hierarchy, they don't. The term development doesn't actually even ring a bell. It's not something that they would understand or be willing to discuss. The elders, because we also interviewed a lot of elders to check what the Taliban were telling us to get a sense of what the local situation might be. The elder will say that there's a big difference between the Taliban who are local Taliban, with whom it's easier for them, of course, to interact because they will know them, will be from the same community, from the same villages, and those they call either foreign Taliban or out area Taliban or the Taliban from Pakistan. And it's not always clear what they mean, whether they mean Pakistani Taliban. Of course, there are no Pakistani Taliban in Faryab for sure, but you might find some of them sometime in Kandahar. They mostly operate in the east, so in fact there shouldn't be too many of them in Kandahar as well. Or they mean the Taliban will come from Pakistan. So the people, typically Kurds, but often Kurds come to Afghanistan accompanied by a regional armed men, bodyguards to escort them, will come in, and typically they come in to enforce the rules, to make sure that the local Taliban do respect the rules. So they might actually refer to these guys, when they say the Taliban from Pakistan might refer to these Kurds who come in and they tend to be, from somewhere else. So not so much concerned with the views of the communities, with the views of the elders, and more inclined to strictly implement whatever rules are in place. So some of the local Taliban confirm that they tend to be softer, more inclined to give some room of maneuver to NGOs, break the rules a little bit, and make things a bit easier for NGOs who do projects among their communities. whereas the leadership element, of course, tends to be more committed to implementing the rules as they've been designed by the leadership. Apart from that, we detected some significant similarities of views on certain issues between elders and Taliban commanders. Criticism toward the work of humanitarian organization and development organization in general, which seems to be relatively fair if you know about development efforts in Afghanistan, the short-termism of some of these projects. I suspect the Taliban pick these things from the elders, particularly local Taliban will be communicating with the elders, discuss these things from time to time, and so they know what to say when they want to do some criticism, which is relatively constructive. They want to sound constructive in the criticism. They pick things from the elders. And when the elders, some were very thankful about humanitarian development engagement with the communities. Many of them were critical in one way or another. So short-termism was one. And the idea that many of these organizations were more interested in, were there for their own purpose or for their own reasons, not to help Afghans. Whether that's fair criticism or not, are not discussed here. But the kind of criticism which is not ideological is more like, we are disappointed from what we see on the ground. In principle, we would like development aid, of course, but the way actually it happens looks like wasteful. Maybe it's not going to the right people, the people who need it. There is, favoritism, et cetera, et cetera. So this kind of more, if you like, rational criticism as opposed to merely ideological or other type of criticism that you do hear from Taliban commanders often. All right. I mentioned this before. Military pressure, the military situation is a major factor in determining how the local Taliban, the Taliban at the bottom of the hierarchy, relate to the rules established by the leadership. It's difficult to demonstrate this, but my sense is that there are two, if you like, chains of commands here. One is the shadow Taliban kind of civilian government, although of course they're all armed to the teeth, but it's basically the governors and the judges and the individuals who are in charge of dealing with humanitarian and development organizations at the local level, who have this set of rules and they tend to stick to them. And then you have the military commission, which is kind of defense minister of the Taliban, which prioritizes military concerns. And they seem to consider perfectly legitimate, if needed, to bypass the civilian chain of command and ban, for example, aid organizations in areas where there's been a lot of pressure on the Taliban, like a lot of night raids. And they don't have probably any evidence that it was humanitarian workers who helped the night raiders or supplied information to them. But essentially they're sending a signal. They're saying, if there is all this targeting of Taliban commanders, we retaliate by, cutting off all aid organization of this area. It's one of the ways they retaliate against these night raids. Of course, the Taliban have limited options here to retaliate. One, of course, is to escalate their own target killings of government officials or what they call government collaborators. One, and two is ban NGOs and aid organizations, because there's not much else they can do. If you are based in the villages, and of course the third one, we don't deal with that in this report, but the third one is close down the schools, because apart from that, there's no much else in terms of government presence at the local level.
Antonio, I'll have to ask you to wrap up now.
Yeah, I think there's not much left. I mentioned these internal divisions, like the local Taliban and maybe what people call the Taliban from Pakistan, the military pressure discussed, and I think I hand over to Ashley again for more words on aid organization and then for some conclusions.